Tariffs have crashed global trade, fueled the Great Depression, helped Nazis rise to power, and left American families paying thousands more for everyday goods, worsening the problems they claim to solve. But even with all these drawbacks, the US loves this blunt economic weapon, and the incoming president plans to use it forcefully. His first round of tariffs forced companies to shift entire supply chains, crushed others they were meant to save, and provoked retaliations that hurt farmers and workers alike. In this episode, we'll explain the real-world consequences of tariffs and what can be expected from Trump's promises. These new tariffs will be less a weapon against US enemies and more a game of Russian roulette. But before we do, I'd like to take a quick moment to thank our channel sponsor, Aura. And actually, it's a really important time to talk about them because hackers may have just stolen the social security numbers of every American. Over 2.9 billion records were recently stolen from National Public Data, which provides personal information to employers, private investigators, staffing agencies, and others doing background checks. These stolen records include a person's full name, address, date of birth, social security number and phone number, alternate names, and birth date. And members of the hacker group have released this information for free online. If you've never been the victim of a data breach before, let me tell you, it's not fun. That stuff is scary, as well as being very intrusive. If you weren't taking precautions with your personal information online before, this should be a huge wake-up call. You've never been more vulnerable online than you are right now. Thankfully, I don't have to worry about it because Aura protects me from this exact scenario. Aura alerts me if they find my phone number, email, or social security number on the dark web. They let me know immediately if anyone tries to use this information to access my credit or bank accounts. And for added peace of mind, they provide up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario happen. They also have a bunch of other features to keep you safe, all inside one app, so you don't have to go looking for a bunch of different services for your VPN, your antivirus, and your data security. You can use the link aura.com/firstthought to try 14 days absolutely free. That's plenty of time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data has been exposed. I highly recommend you do this right now, because not only is National Public Data not going to do anything to help us, they probably aren't even going to face any repercussions for this leak. I'm not leaving myself and my family vulnerable to data breaches. And if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/firstthought to try Aura for 2 weeks absolutely free. Okay, back to the video. So, what is a tariff? In a nutshell, tariffs are taxes on imports meant to protect local industries and create government revenue. Emphasis on meant to. The idea behind them is that by making foreign goods more expensive, consumers will buy domestic competitors, though this often means paying more since companies can sneakily raise prices to just below the tariff tax. There are two main types: value-added, those that tack on a percentage of the product's value, and specific tariffs, which add a fixed fee per unit. For instance, a 10% value-added tariff on a $1,000 laptop adds $100, while a $2 specific tariff on shoes adds $2 to each pair of shoes. These taxes can apply to anything, from food and electronics to steel and aluminum, which increases the price of these items and anything that requires them. Today, approximately 2/3 of global trade involves products assembled from parts made from other countries. Tariffs force companies to renegotiate contracts, find new suppliers, or absorb higher costs, all of which create inefficiencies that complicate and disrupt trade. For example, the first Trump regime's tariffs on China went from less than 3% in 2017 to 24% by 2019. Large corporations like Cisco and Macy's moved production to places like Vietnam and Malaysia, which added additional costs and wasteful supply chain diversions as they scrambled to avoid these new tariffs. The US has historically used tariffs to isolate itself economically. After World War I, the US emerged as the least damaged, richest, and biggest economy in the world. Yet they still passed the Emergency Tariff Act in 1921 and the Fordney-McCumber Tariff a year later, which imposed duties of up to 50%, which made it even harder for Europe to repay their debts to the US. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930 took things to record levels, which provoked retaliation from France, Italy, and Japan, while Britain and Germany turned to quotas and their own protectionism. By 1933, global trade was near total collapse, falling to just 35% of 1929 levels, worsening the Great Depression and fueling an inflation and unemployment crisis in Germany that helped the Nazis seize power. Unsurprisingly, fascism and protectionism don't fix anything. By 1935, global trade had fallen even further, down to 28% of its pre-1929 levels. Since the 1940s, entrenched neoliberal dogma has asserted that free, open trade is the best way to boost productivity, to give consumers more choice, and to strengthen diplomatic ties. In 2016, lobbies favoring tighter protection had gained new momentum and influence over the Trump regime, which would break with nearly 80 years of US policy. They falsely claimed that US allies like Germany and major trade partners like China exploited this openness to grow their own surpluses and limited US exports, and that very strong tariffs were needed to fix the situation, which, understandably, spooked stakeholders both at home and abroad. Meanwhile, various industries warned that tariffs could raise household costs by up to $7,600 per year. But Trump soldiered on, pledging to revive domestic manufacturing through higher tariffs on imports, arguing it would stimulate US production. It's important to note here that the tariffs on China won rare bipartisan support, with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer calling China, quote, the real trade enemy threatening American jobs, echoing Trump's rhetoric. Washington slapped tariffs on products made in China to the tune of $375 billion. Many of these applied to consumer and industrial tech, because of Trump's accusations that China was stealing intellectual property from big US tech companies on a large scale, and through vague, unfair practices. Trump then began to focus on steel, claiming his tariffs would curtail unfair foreign competition. In spite of these promises, prices rose, job growth lagged behind other sectors, and stock values plummeted. What's more, because these tariffs are effectively taxes on US companies that import steel, they ended up costing such firms nearly $3 billion per year. While steel firms saw partial rebounds after 2020, the persistent inefficiencies caused by the tariffs prevented a full recovery. These tariffs, justified by vague national security concerns, even led to friction with close allies like Canada, Germany, Japan, and South Korea. Of course, China didn't take this lying down, and responded with tariffs of their own targeting nearly 6,000 US products worth $109.3 billion, while hinting at more disruptive retaliation by curbing US farm imports, placing key American crops, like soybeans, at risk since US-China soybean trade accounts for about 25% of the global market. Also, 9 rounds of countermeasures targeted over $31.8 billion in US food exports, focusing heavily on American farm products. It slashed exports by $11.6 billion and redirected the sales outside the US. Overall, the US lost over $15 billion in farm trade, while competitors in South America and Europe gained ground in critical items like soybeans and pork. Meanwhile, during all this, China took a commanding lead in 5G technology worldwide thanks to Huawei hardware and the government's massive investment in their space program. Finally, after over 16 months of negotiations, the US and China agreed to a limited trade deal, amounting to a truce in their trade war. The US agreed to put off a tariff increase on $250 billion of Chinese imports, and China agreed to buy $40 to $50 billion of US agricultural products, as well as, quote, to be more transparent in foreign market interventions, ease US entry into the financial services sector, and enhance enforcement of intellectual property rights. All told, these 7 rounds of tariff increases affected over $325 billion of exports from China across 6,428 affected products, representing over 14% of exports. This incoherent struggle to balance strategic, economic, and political aims failed to meet any of Trump's stated goals. The deficit grew, prices went up on thousands of products, jobs were lost, and the US gained no new leverage in negotiations. China has seen and dealt with previous turbulence. For example, dependence on manufacturing exports in 2007 and 2008 dropped from 30% of GDP to 18%, which, somewhat counterintuitively, is due in part to its larger share of global production. Its import demand for manufacturing inputs slid from 23% to under 10% of GDP, keeping the trade surplus stable despite tariffs. Their Made in China 2025 program expanded local production of advanced goods, resulting in most value now being domestic. The Belt and Road Initiative emerged as part of this internal rebalancing, but it also offers investment opportunities that promote international cooperation with an eye toward multilateral openness. By linking overland and maritime routes spanning Asia, Europe, and beyond, the BRI takes advantage of this connectivity-driven trade growth. So far, only a quarter of its planned $1 trillion budget has been spent, with another trillion secured through entities like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The project includes 38 maritime agreements covering 47 countries, infrastructure investments in 34 countries, and port projects in places such as Genoa and Trieste in Italy. Strategic choke points like the Strait of Malacca and the Suez Canal have been addressed by adding new routes that avoid them entirely, which helps immensely in de-dollarization. In fact, even if these choke points weren't an issue politically, it's likely China would do it anyway in order to further diversify trade routes. So, what will another Trump term bring? Economically speaking, he's promised to impose a 10% tariff across the board for most, if not all, trading partners, as well as a whopping 60% tariff on all Chinese imports. From here, we can only speculate, but we'll do so based on past and current data. Let's start with income. Estimates show that low-income earners could see their take-home pay drop by as much as 3.5%, and middle-income earners would end up paying an extra $1,700 per year in taxes. For a country where 66% of the population can't afford a $1,000 emergency, this would be catastrophic. This is consistent with previous tariffs where the average household income shrank by $1,300. However, since there's much more trade today, that 10% tariff would act more like a consumption tax of up to $1,500 per year, which of course will contribute significantly to inflation. But let's zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture. A common, though imprecise way to understand a nation's economy is by seeing how things like the GDP and purchasing power parity, which reflects the relative value of a currency by accounting for differences in local costs and price levels across countries, compare. A 10% blanket tariff alone can drain about 1% of GDP, and in combination with other measures, consumers might shoulder an extra 1.8% in expenses. That's roughly $500 billion annually. And while that sounds and is very concerning, its effect on purchasing power parity is much more important to you, the consumer. By some estimates, Trump's 10% blanket tariff will cost the American consumption base over $1 trillion just for your everyday items. And this is before inflation. That is very bad news. But why are the prices so high when they're supposed to protect local industry and make things cheaper? Well, by limiting foreign imports, that also means that anything imported to make the stuff made in the USA will be affected by those tariffs, raising the product cost and therefore creating higher prices for you, the consumer. Tariffs from 2018 and 2019 raised costs for suppliers by more than 4%, contributing to a 1.4% drop in manufacturing jobs. And that's just the short-term effects. Research since shows that manufacturing employment did not rise long-term. So the expectations for another, higher tariff are even worse. But the in-store cost increases are just a downstream factor. The cascade starts with suppliers and producers. In response to Trump's first tariffs, producers shifted operations abroad, a change which requires significant investment and effort. So others simply tried to avoid it by pretending to be from a country that isn't affected by the tariff. Schemes of this kind affect everything from mattresses to solar panels, and law enforcement was only able to stop about $500 million worth of evasions last year. These schemes are openly described as a shell game by those in the industry, with all involved parties rolling the dice knowing there's a good chance their products will slip through the cracks. We can see the issue tariffs create by taking a look at one recent example, a US retailer that sold cabinets made in China. Tariffs caused the price of their products to skyrocket, so this company told their supplier to move operations to Malaysia before they'd continue as a customer. The supplier agreed. However, later inspections revealed containers labeled "Made in Malaysia" contained products that had actually been made in China, something which the supplier admitted afterwards. The cost of simply correcting the customs documents cost the retailer $650,000. This, of course, led to a lawsuit and other legal battles. When this effect is applied to the entire industry, we can see how cabinet imports from China plunged from 1.3 billion to just 26 million, while Vietnam's share surged. A tariff of 60%, like the one Trump is planning, will make this look tame by comparison, barely noteworthy. But since you probably don't buy cabinets all the time, let's look at some more relatable products. Smartphone shipments from places like India and South Korea climbed 42%, with laptops and chips also rerouted. Toys, gaming consoles, and lithium-ion batteries still predominantly come from China and account for over 70% of US imports of all products in that category. Producers of things like semiconductors for all our tech gadgets and laptops moved their operations out of China. This has caused imports of these products from China to drop by 35% since 2017. But even with that drop, China still accounts for 14% of total US imports. Not to mention, many Vietnamese and Mexican goods rely on Chinese components. Needless to say, prices are about to make American jaws drop and make life that much more expensive. The US has wielded unprecedented hegemonic power for about 80 years now. This is because the US frequently abuses its power. And now, many countries are seeking alternative trade partners. Enter Brics, a growing organization of countries, beginning with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that is building multipolar institutions that push for economic sovereignty outside of American control. At the 2024 Kazan summit in Russia, Brics gained 13 new members, including Belarus, Turkey, Algeria, Nigeria, and Uganda. In January of this year, 4 other countries joined: Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE. Quite the diverse group. Partner status puts countries on the path to full membership, which looks increasingly valuable as the US empire continues to decline. Xi Jinping called the organization a vanguard for governance and international finance reform, and others have praised this impressive roster's potential to present a serious challenge to the dollar's dominance. Brics, with its new members, now represents over 1/3 of the world's GDP, over 40% of the global population, and produces roughly 30% of the world's oil. This amassing of alliances and resources provides a stable and sound base from which to create new international systems and standards. China's cross-border interbank payment system, for instance, boasts nearly 1,500 participating banks in 113 countries, handling $16.52 quadrillion in 2023. A respectable amount even when compared to SWIFT's $150 quadrillion. Russia has also built a domestic financial transaction system to replace SWIFT, which they've used for processing nearly all domestic financial transactions. Their Mir payment card accounts for the rest, and makes up half of Russian card transactions and functions overseas in places like Venezuela, Belarus, and parts of Africa. Russia is integrating their systems with Iran's for direct currency exchanges, which could be the start of a truly international system, rather than the weaponized and US-controlled SWIFT system. And while total substitution remains out of reach in the short term, alternative payment systems and domestic technologies have shown they're very good at finding ways around Western finance. The US empire is rapidly declining. That much is obvious. But what isn't as clear is how the US will handle it. This isn't the first time an empire has fallen since the Industrial Revolution. That honor goes to Britain. The US decline has much in common with Britain's, so we'll briefly take a look at their similarities to make an educated guess at what's on the horizon. As China has become a serious player on the world stage, the US has found itself staring down similar economic challenges as those Britain faced when Germany rapidly became a potent economic force at the end of the 19th century. With all the talk of how good and rational competition is, in practice, hegemonic powers hate it. Fast forward to after September 11th, 2001. American unipolarity seems untouchable, even though militant non-state organizations such as the Taliban were making a mockery of the US military, which, again, mirrors the kind of threats Britain encountered in their vast array of colonies. And who could forget the Bush regime's claim of being the lone country allowed to engage in preemptive interventions and preemptive strikes anywhere in the world? That isn't new either, because, as you've already guessed, Britain used to do the same thing. Not only that, but the overall unilateral posture taken by both countries during their decline goes against everything they claimed to believe in pursuit of power they'll never again attain. The US is desperately trying to hold on to its violent and coercive empire in any way it can, which makes the United States the most dangerous country on Earth. But it's not all doom and gloom. As we've seen, a fairer, more collaborative international monetary framework is being developed to reduce the dollar's dominance and ensure there's a stable system in place for when Western control falters. This is especially important as China is planning to settle oil in their own currency, the yuan. China is the world's largest importer of oil. Not using US dollars to process transactions will cause a significant disruption to the petrodollar status quo. The petrodollar system means most oil transactions are priced and settled in US dollars. Therefore, in order to buy oil, countries and their central banks must hold large reserves of US dollars, creating consistent demand for the US dollar in foreign exchange markets. So China setting their oil sales in yuan will require countries and central banks to exchange a significant portion of their dollars for yuan. This means an increase in demand for the yuan and decrease in demand for the dollar, with the consequence being the dollar's value dropping while the yuan's value rises. When a currency loses value, it becomes a driving force in inflation. Add to this what Brics is doing to de-dollarize and provide a framework that allows for transactions between nations to be conducted in their own currencies, and it becomes crystal clear that the US is going to be left behind due to its unwillingness to give up hegemony in favor of cooperation and equality. Tariffs have their place here and there depending on economic policy, but the political right has opportunistically presented them as an easy fix to complex economic problems. History shows that they don't deliver, and often harm the people they're meant to protect by driving up prices, disrupting supply chains, stifling trade, and ensuring retaliation, leaving entire industries scrambling and the working class paying the bill. From Hoover to Biden, on the eve of Trump's second term, they have been touted as a tool of strength, but have instead proven to be costly, short-sighted gambits, wrecking balls inside the glass house that is the American economy. Episodes like this one are made possible thanks to our generous patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support the show, and get some great perks while you're at it, consider becoming a patron. Perks include access to our Discord server, early access to videos, ad-free episodes, and more. You can help us keep the channel afloat by becoming a patron at patreon.com/firstthought. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.